All right, welcome. I'm Stephanie Eberly. I'm Manager of Educational Resources and Client Services at the School of Medicine's Career Center here at Stanford. And I'm pleased to be here today with Richard Maines, the first speaker in our professional development series, Making the Most of Your Research and Clinical Training. Richard is founder and principal scientist at Maines Associates and will be speaking today on the topic of strategic correspondence and marketing, improvements in writing to advance your career. This is a very important topic, not just as you hone your communications within the context of your training, but also as you continue in your own career regardless of what's next. I'm often in consultation with some of my students and trainees here, and we talk about how to best market your skills, the skills that you have garnered here. And today Richard is going to talk specifically about that and how to do that in a way that advances, like we said, your career. So welcome, Richard. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. First, I'd like to really thank Stephanie Eberly for inviting me. This is a different kind of audience and a slightly different twist on what I've been doing for about 25 years, in large part with NASA. And it has really forced me to kind of rethink a lot of things in terms of really, self-promotion, which for scientists is something that I never heard of until probably, 5 or 6 years ago. Your science is supposed to promote you, is what I was always taught. So, So the title of this is Strategic Personal Marketing, which is for science people, is a bit of a stretch. For me, anyway. Maybe not for you. For the 20-something crowd, I think they're much more used to this than I am. But science-based communications to advance your career. Let me tell you a little bit about my background and why I'm even up here speaking about this. It's not because I'm an expert in either career development or any aspect of this, but I have been doing a lot of science communications related work for 25 or 30 years now, connected with space life sciences research and development. And I've learned a lot the hard way, and I'm here to share, some of the mistakes I've made and some of the lessons I've learned. The focus of my career was really working with scientists and engineers in developing life sciences payloads for spaceflight. And that's a whole complicated process that involves design, development, test, engineering, and an extraordinary amount of documentation. And my work was mainly in the documentation area, beginning with proposals, evaluating them, trying to interpret them in terms of what had to be developed, and then all the way through developing documentation that was shared by engineers and life scientists. And because we were working with a lot of international programs, we were also translating information between English and Russian, English and French. And so there's a translation aspect to this. And communications were always the key challenge in these kinds of distributed, complex, cross-disciplinary projects. Well, the world has become more like that rather than less, it seems to me. That's what's happening in Silicon Valley. It's what's happening in the exploding area of biomedical research and medical research. So by default, I became, sort of a translator and storyteller, because we started working with the Russians, for instance, in the early 80s. They had no computers, no desktop computers. In fact, NASA had no desktop computers. I founded Maines Associates in 1982 because there were no desktop computers at NASA Ames Research Center, and I was pumping out documentation like mad. So I left an on-site contractor position, started Maines Associates, and bought a desktop computer in 1982, not knowing how to use it, but I learned fairly quickly. So my business, in some ways, is totally driven by the computer, and then gradually the internet, and gradually the web. And now everything, of course, is online. So my career spans that whole history. But what I would like to do is to get some sense of who's in the audience before I even wade into this. You put your hand up if you're involved in biomedical research. Lots. You put your hand up if you're working more in the bioengineering or technical end of that in some fashion, or software. Put your hand up if you're working in all of those areas. Put your hand up if you're working in some other area entirely different than that. Okay, so it's very heavily biomedically oriented, which is interesting. Whoops. So this is basically what I'm going to try to walk through here as quickly as I can. We're going to talk a little bit about traditional science communications, which I'm sure most of you have been introduced to in your careers at this point, and what's happening to it. Major changes are underway. And also the idea of a science-based brand, and who would care about such a thing, which is a relatively new idea out there, and certainly relatively new to me. And then talk a little bit about your career stakeholders. That's a very important and a relatively new idea. And then using your science communications, which you're doing of all sorts, from emails to blogs to papers to presentations to overviews, strategically, thinking about how you can actually do them so they're both effective and so they can work for you in your career development. And then increasing something that we call your VCR factor, which is visibility, credibility, and relevance by writing. It's my thesis, and not just mine, that writing is really the fundamental basic root of how you're viewed by your peers, your colleagues, by prospective employers, and that'll be really the core theme of this presentation. There's going to be a presentation coming up shortly that talks about speaking, which is really a very complementary, of course, aspect of how you're viewed. But I still think that writing, because it's persistent, it's online, people can go back to it, they can read it in detail, is really the rock-bottom fundamental key message of who you are, what you care about, and what you're trying to do. And then the idea of making these science-based stories, which is what they really are, compelling and interesting to the broadest possible audience, which is something that I've had to do in working with all these different disciplines in these different countries and different people and different managers, many, many different stakeholders in NASA life sciences research. This is, I'm calling old science communications. I'm just not going to dwell on this long, but this is sort of the traditional view that I have of standard peer-to-peer communications, where you're basically communicating with people that have had similar research backgrounds. If people in the room don't really get what's going on, they're probably generally not going to raise their hand and say, I don't really understand what you're talking about. They're going to kind of hunker down and say, gee, I'm out of my league. A lot of similar backgrounds are assumed in these kinds of communications in terms of education, knowledge, methods, analysis, and language. Less and less that is the case. Research is becoming incredibly global, very cross-disciplinary. So you've got students who, in fact, are struggling to build bridges across disciplines. You've got departments that are cross-disciplinary by nature. I don't know how it is here, but the integrated biology department, the way they do that is they just pull in people from all kinds of different departments and stir it up. So there's all kinds of internal communications going on that are creating the cross-disciplinary, really cutting-edge and innovative research. And then the journal-specific reporting formats, which you're probably all quite familiar with. Let me ask a question. How many of you in this room have ever co-authored or written a peer-reviewed journal publication? Oh, my goodness. Okay. So you know all what I'm talking about. So the standard cycle, in my experience, used to be about 18 months, and this is the process that you went through. That's drastically changed. And then the bullet at the bottom is really the tidal wave that has swept through, especially life sciences, I think. Computers, the internet, globalization, cross-disciplinary research, and then really sort of a revolution, I think, in the communications realm, where everything is ending up online. So what about this personal brand idea? You're still communicating peer-to-peer, I think most of the time, but what I think is happening that's relatively new is that you now are communicating with an awful lot of stakeholders in a way that I think was probably more in the background before, but now it's becoming much more in the foreground. Also, a reminder to me, can you just take out a pen and paper or something to scratch on and ask you to do a 1-minute assignment at the end of this view graph? So pull that out now so you've got something to write with. It's not a quiz. You won't be asked about the answer. The brand, the personal brand that's associated with biomedical research, as far as I can tell, is something like this. It's what you communicate, produce, as a scientist and researcher, and are known for. Your brand, really, like a bottle of Coca-Cola, which is really crass, promises the value you can deliver. And like it or not, there's an awful lot of this out there in the marketplace connected with jobs, career development, and especially funding. And my thesis, again, that I mentioned before, is that your ability to write and communicate who you are, what you're interested in, and why anybody else should really be interested in you is a key part of your communication in the sciences as well as your career development. Your creativity and values flow from what you're passionate about. When I was in graduate school, I don't remember a lot of passion. I remember a lot of ongoing research projects. I remember graduate students leaving and other graduate students taking their place and being trained to do what they were doing. I don't remember being involved in lots of discussions about funding or writing creative grants or competition. It was kind of a science factory, as far as I can remember it. That has really changed. So your assignment now is to take 1 minute, and I'll give you the start time in about 10 seconds here, to write down 3 short bullets. It can be 1 word or a short phrase about things that come to mind when you think about yourself of how you might identify your brand. And if brand means nothing to you, and it takes a while to digest that, think about your just reputation. Just use the word reputation. When people think of you, what do you think, in fact, comes to mind? 3 bullets, starting right now. Whoop. Sorry. You're halfway through. Okay. Now, I asked you to do that simply because it's an interesting exercise to just think about. I'm still working on, the branding in our company. Our tagline that we've had for a while is bringing science and technology to life. Kind of a double entendre. When people hear that, they don't have a clue what I'm talking about. So we're working on, other things that are more specific. But I also want to mention that if you have a question as I'm going along here that you really want to answer because you think I'm off base, don't understand what's going on, please ask it. And if we go on too long, we can, continue it on at the end of the discussion. So feel free to ask questions as we go. I really would like this to be a two-way street. So this says, surprise, you're branded. And I think that 20-somethings are much more used to this idea than I am. You're online already. Probably everyone here that hasn't been involved with the web, and I can't imagine there's anyone in this room that hasn't. You have some kind of products online, you have some kind of profiles online, you have some kind of presentations online, you have some kind of photos and images online. There's Google, there's LinkedIn, Facebook, SlideShare, Google Scholar, websites, blogs, bios, everything. And if you take a look at that and just scan yourself, sometimes you find some really bizarre things. Sometimes you find just junk. Sometimes you see presentations you wish, in fact, that have been thrown in the trash. And one of the things that I strongly recommend, and I have to do this for myself, is to write a 1- or 2-page profile of yourself and put it online. Who is looking for you on the web, and why? And are you looking good? It's a question. Everybody is looking for you on the web. Your colleagues, your students, your mentors, your professors, your neighbors, your friends, your whatever. You're certainly people who are thinking about interviewing you. Anybody you send any information to regarding a job is going to immediately go online. So you've got to have that in your head, and some of that you can't control, but it's very, very good to be proactive and try to make sure there's information online that at least represents, you think, decently, maybe, who you are and what you're up to and what you'd like people to find. There's at the end of this presentation, which I guess is going to be online, right, Stephanie? At the end of this, I've got 3 view graphs actually with just references of material I think that would be really useful to look at. One of them is personal branding and web reputation, which is a presentation which is very, very interesting on this topic, and I'm not going to go into more detail on that. But your brand develops as you pursue your research and your careers. And one of the key points I'd like to make in this presentation is that your brand, as it evolves, is the value that you can provide to a collaborator. And collaboration, in the sciences is becoming a very, very important thing, leveraging resources and collaboration. So communicating, your potential value to someone who might like to work with you on a project is a very, very important step. Now, what about stakeholders? I don't even know what a stakeholder is. I mean, the term. I picture some guy with a tent and somebody standing next to him with a whole bunch of stakes, or I haven't quite figured out where that term came from. I was going to look it up. But they're basically people who have a, some kind of vested interest in your success. And these are just a few candidates, colleagues, your colleague network. They're fellow advocates in your research area. These are people that are promoting research in the same area that you're working in. You can do this jointly. You can help each other do this. Your supervisors and mentors, They taught you, so you're part of their reputation. Your students, your patients, your professional evaluators, in some ways, those are your customers. They're very important people and stakeholders in your success and career. The grant makers and funding organizations, they provide the cash for jobs, for research. If you're going into the business arena, and so many people are one way or another at some point in their careers, your investors have a major stake in your success in your career, and your alma mater. Your career center is very interested in your potential fame and fortune. These are just a few stakeholders. Each of you probably has different people you might put in that category. And this is part of the idea of brand, I think, being of interest to a much wider group than it used to be. And part of it is that everything is so transparent. Everything is online. It's so visible. So you've got more people who have a vested interest in what that information is, how it looks, how people think about it, and how they evaluate it. And that's a real shift. Strategic communications, which is part of the title of this presentation. As you write, in any of these various categories that you write, it's really important to try to think about your audience, your stakeholders who are going to be reading what you're writing. And one of my recommendations is to, I just say writing well is the simplest and best way to communicate your value to your stakeholders in your evolving career. Your stakeholders are key assets for you, and you need to understand who they are. You need to appreciate them. You need to provide value to them when you can. And your stakeholders, of course, for other people as well. So it's a large, interrelated network that's going on here. Writing well is probably the simplest way for you to communicate, the potential value you can bring to a department, to a business, to whatever you're aspiring to join. In your writing, trying to make your writing memorable, and that's a simple. That just simply means that someone, after they read something you write, will remember what you said. And I'm sure you've had circumstances where you've read somebody's abstract, and it's so clearly written in such a fascinating fashion, you really kind of get what's interesting here, and you're going to go on and read the paper. Other people who write abstracts, you don't have a clue what they're talking about or why you might want to read the paper. It's just a piece of, of text. Making something memorable and compelling is increasingly really a requirement for science-related writing. And if you write well, your shareholders will share what you write and send it around. That's the other thing that's drastically changed. In addition to transparency, the distribution of this information is now instantaneous. So people who have some vested interest in your career can just send something to someone who might be interested and open up a whole door for you instantaneously. We do this every day, all day long. But think about it strategically. These are just some examples of written communications that we all do as life scientists. And my view of this, however, is that this is a whole broad array of everything that's very informal, from emails all the way down to very formal overviews you might write, detailed analysis of your particular research area, pitches that you might make to Congress. This is not something that people do, so much at the beginning of their career, but they sure do it as they get into their career, more and more and more and more. One of the stakeholders in your career is your people in Congress who represent you. And in this new administration, that's going to be even more so. I'm in Congress probably twice a year with various science organizations, doing presentations on the Hill, meeting one-on-one with Congress people. They absolutely live on the kind of information you can bring to them that they can understand and appreciate the value of, and then do something about in terms of legislation. You'll learn this if you haven't learned it already. But what you're doing in all these communications, you're bringing some kind of evidence plus your interpretation in providing a viewpoint. In an email, in a blog, in a science paper. It's more structured and it's more controlled in a science paper, but it's a wide range of interpretations. Anybody who's written a paper and sent it in for peer review certainly appreciates the number of interpretations you can have in a set of data. I don't think I ever appreciated, I can remember writing my first paper in graduate school for publication and just being so totally terrified about being out there, being right on the page, my interpretation of something. I was used to doing it informally. I was used to presenting it to my fellow students, talking to my advisor about it. But the notion of putting it into an international journal and somehow having, obviously the 150 experts who knew 10,000 more than I did things about this topic was very, very terrifying. So practicing this with your colleagues, with your people who really have a stake in your career is very, very important to kind of learn how to handle that. How to handle severe criticism of your conclusions. I will mention a story that I was going to tell here connected with this. It's about Carl Sagan, a master science communications person, an astrophysicist, somebody who worked across many, many disciplines early in his career when, in fact, that was considered very, very unwise to do. You couldn't be a master in more than one career, and he was working in about 4 of them. And he kept on sort of changing his focus over time. But anyway, amazing man. Controversial, but still amazing. I was in Washington, D.C. at the first International Space Congress, 1992. There were over 150 countries there. I had no idea there were 150 countries that even knew about space, let alone had some strong vested interest in it. Lots and lots of countries from the third world. About 800, 900 people probably showed up. There was a giant banquet in a room the size of an airplane hangar, and Carl Sagan was the keynote speaker. He was up on a platform about 12 feet high wearing one of these things, the first time I'd ever seen a wireless system, 1992, a few years ago. Giant screen in the background giving a multimedia presentation effectively on life in the universe. There'd been a lot of wine. This was after dinner. People were feeling quite cheerful and enjoying this presentation. And he was about halfway into it, and all of a sudden, somebody right in front of the stage at a table stood up and started talking to him while he was speaking. There wasn't a Q&A going on. Everybody in the room thought, okay, the guy's drunk. They're going to come drag him out. Sagan looked over at this guy, recognized him immediately as a very disgruntled, somewhat angry, emotionally upset colleague, and went over and engaged this man. And it turns out Sagan and this investigator were key scientists in the Viking missions, 2 Viking missions that went to Mars searching for life. There was not clear evidence for the existence of life. It was very controversial. There was some suggestion that there was, some that there wasn't. This dispute is still going on. Sagan was not convinced there was. This investigator was convinced. It was mostly his experiment that there was. And he was just fuming at the mouth because Sagan had said something in his presentation that he took offense to. Sagan walked over, introduced the man, shook his hand, told quickly the story of who he was, what was important about this experiment, identified the controversy. So as he put it on top of the table, it was still alive, thanked this man for his presentation. He sat down, Sagan turned around and went on with his presentation as if it was all planned. That's part of science communications. Barack Obama has some of the skills that are in evidence that Sagan had. It's a very complicated, dynamic set of information and disputes and stories and fascinating things going on, and you have to learn how to take really severe criticism and turn it around and make it, part of the fascinating thing that we're all involved in. But it's just a very interesting story that I will never forget. It's a very, very important lesson to learn how to do that and to not to be afraid to, in fact, stand up, ask the dumb question, one of my favorite things to do in presentations. I usually proceed with, I'd like to ask the dumb question. And of course, half the people in the room also share the same dumb question, but they're certainly not going to ask it. And I learned that from the head of my lab, the environmental physiology lab at UC Berkeley, a guy named Noah Pace, who was despised by NASA. He helped start NASA's Space Life Sciences program at NASA headquarters, but he always asked the dumb, embarrassing questions, the politically incorrect questions that stimulated a whole buzz of discussion that always continued even after the meeting. But bureaucrats really did not like that kind of stir. I love it. So we went through this. Now, we've talked a little bit about your brand, which in many ways is your reputation and what you bring with you to your stakeholders and to the people who work with you, the value you bring. And this is a concept of marketing that brand. A crass concept, but in fact, this is really sort of the heart of what I think we all have to learn how to do more in the age of the internet. This is the idea that I talked about before. Visibility, credibility, and relevance. I am here today being more visible, trying to be more credible, and trying to be relevant to your interests. We all have to do more of this, stepping a little bit outside the boundaries of what we normally do and try to communicate with other people, and that's how we learn. In terms of visibility, the key thing is to try to have stakeholders in your career who you've identified, many of whom may not even know you yet, recognize you. And one of the ways to do that, of course, is in your writing, and another way is in presentations like this, in scientific presentations. Get out there. Network. Ask questions. And ask, dumb questions. And become, known as somebody who's really interested and in pursuing things they don't understand. Credibility. You do that really by making your true value known. What's coming out of your research, contributions you may make in a clinical setting, your ability to communicate with researchers, your ability to communicate with patients. What's your value? What do you bring to this? And that's part of the brand exercise that we did earlier in our 1-minute session. And then relevance. The key issue there is demonstrating to stakeholders how your value can increase theirs. You may not think of it that way very often, but in fact, heads of departments, heads of clinics, CEOs of businesses automatically think that way. When they're hiring somebody, when they're interviewing somebody, when they're looking to potentially collaborate with somebody, this is what is really on their mind. You need to begin to think that way. What do you have that's potentially of value? In any kind of an interview, that's absolutely key. And then writing effectively online is one of the best ways to do this because it's visible. You can send it to people. People can find it online. and this is becoming just essential for all of us. I don't know how many times you may have, on some kind of a written assignment in any kind of a class in the history of your education, received a note at the bottom that says something like, well and clearly written. When I was at UC Berkeley, the head of at the environmental physiology lab, the head of our lab wrote detective novels for a hobby. He was a fantastic writer. And this is pre-computer era, so everything we wrote, every monthly status report we wrote, every quarterly status report we wrote on our NASA contract was hand-typed. It was handwritten on yellow foolscap, went into the secretarial pool, they typed the thing up, it came back, you had an edit, it went back and got retyped, then it went to the head of the lab and got edited and retyped. So this is an incredibly painful process. And my writing just got ripped to shreds. I thought I was a fairly decent writer. It's just every single time it went in, I'd come back and I was just hardly even recognized it. That's one of the ways I learned to write. One of the things that I recommend that you do is to follow this process, which is a very simple process that people probably learn in high school, but don't master. It's the creating an outline to clarify and order your concepts. A lot of people just start right off with their writing, write a really crappy first draft, just get it out on paper, rewrite it, read it out loud, rewrite it again, and then have colleagues comment on your draft. It's one of the best things you can do, and you can do that for them as well. And then take the feedback you get and use that to rewrite again. Let it sit. You can't do this again and again and again. You have to let it sit, come back to it for a fresh read, and then read it out loud. That's where you catch all the grammatical errors and the sentences that just don't make sense, and then put it to bed. Editing your colleagues' papers is one of the best ways to learn how to write. You don't have to show it to them if they're not asking for it, but it's a great way because you're looking at content that you have some good sense of, what the content's about and what it should say, and it's a great practice. I've learned more, I think, in editing the content that's come out of 25 years of Maine's Associates probably in how to write than anything else. These are some tips on learning to write better. I mentioned the first one, reading colleagues' papers. I took an extension course at UC Berkeley in essay writing and was struck by how incredibly difficult the course was, but how valuable it was. It's a great way to really hone your writing down, not exactly in your specialty area, but to learn the skills of clear writing, good analysis, making good arguments, and conclusions. Writing for broad audiences, which is something that Maine's Associates has increasingly done over the years. In order to write for all these different disciplines, all these different interest areas, we have to rise up to a fairly high level of writing, probably about, well, proposals are typically written in the NASA realm for 9th or 10th grade because you never know who's going to read them. You're going to have managers reading them, you're going to have scientists reading them, you're going to have engineers reading them, you're going to have budgetary people reading them. So you have to write, at a very, very broad level. That is true also for your science writing. Write for a broader audience. You can always go into more detail during a presentation or if somebody objects and doesn't understand it. But going the other way is very, very difficult. So one of the points I want to make here is you really are your writing. In terms of your brand, that's what people see. You can be a brilliant speaker, which is probably unlikely, and be a poor writer. I have a feeling the two actually are quite interwoven. But your writing is really what lasts. It's what goes into the literature. It's your place where you get a chance to communicate your passion and why you're excited about what you're doing. If you don't do that, it's an incredible lost opportunity. Lots of science writing is dry as a bone, and very few people will read it. Do not be afraid to express, the potential impact of what you're doing and why you think it's interesting. Anybody writing a proposal these days, a grant proposal, has to do that very, very effectively, because the standard review of grants is that 50% of them just immediately go on another table and are never looked at again because they're incomprehensible. Totally incomprehensible. The other 50% are quickly sorted through, and about maybe half of those then are selected because they have some ability to really communicate something that's potentially of value to the grant program. And then it goes on from there. You don't want to be in that first half. And I have read hundreds of proposals submitted to NASA, and I would guess that 75% of them were pretty much incomprehensible. And it's a devastating thing to see something that you know is really important, but somebody could not communicate it. So this is a big issue. Very, very important for your career. So take it seriously. Now this is something I threw in at the end here, which is really far out. Maybe not to you, but to me. What is a tribal leader? It sounds like drums and caves, Neanderthals, and it probably is. And the evolution of human communities was all tribal, with a leader, with a small group allied with them, with the ability to communicate, with a vested interest of some sort, with a lot of danger nearby, and we evolved this way for millions of years. This has not left us. There's a book that was just written called Tribes, We Need You to Lead Us. And I picked it up just partly out of amusement, written by Seth Godin, who really is a marketing guy, but has written many, many books. His view is that a tribe is an idea with a leader and followers. My interpretation of this into the biomedical world is that the leader really is you as a passionate leader. Nothing happens in a science area without somebody with passion leading it. Nothing happens in a lab, nothing happens in a department, nothing happens in Congress. Very little happens without leaders who are willing to effectively provide the inspiration around which followers gather. Now, followers are not just a bunch of sheep following a leader. A tribal leader is not a manager, and the followers are not employees. The tribal leader provides the initial passion that attracts those who value and want to share it and spread it. Our new president is a master at this. His entire campaign was built on this concept. His transition was built on this concept. His presidency is being built on this concept. It directly applies to your career path. When you're trying to communicate in your writing, you're really, in many ways, stepping up to being a leader in the thoughts you're trying to express. It's very, very important to have leaders to make anything happen. Our country right now is in the most dire situation it's been, certainly in my lifetime, and we desperately need leaders, and they can be leaders of groups of 2 or 3 in a lab. They can be leaders who are doing some evaluation of something that's happening in a department that's not working. They can be a team that's writing a grant and trying to kind of do a breakthrough idea and get it funded. They can be a new startup, but you've got to have a leader And generally what happens with good leaders is they just provide kind of the catalyst for others to form around it, and you begin to have some real action. This is a very, very important change that's going on, and I think Obama and his wife, who I've seen interviewed many, many times, are masters at it. They are open, they are transparent, they are inclusive, they are open to conflicting ideas, they're simply trying to make decisions in a timely fashion, get as much agreement as they possibly can, get energy marshaled around it, and move ahead. This is an issue for us as biomedical scientists. It's a very, very important thing that you look at yourself and think about the potential you have if you're in the area that you really care about of being a leader. So this book is in the reference list as well. There's a bunch of references I've provided here. One of the very best books I've ever seen is the first one by Montgomery, which is just a beautiful piece of writing and a book that's well worth reading and fun to read on communicating science. It has everything in it that you would ever want to have in your particular career as a guide. And there's a wonderful chapter in there on writing well as all the topics that I've mentioned. There's another one that I just discovered. It's actually a 2001 book by Stephanie Barnard that is focused on the biomedical world specifically in communications that also is very highly regarded. There's some books on branding. And there's this book by Joe LoCicero on business communications, delivering your message with clarity and efficiency, is a direct complement to what you're doing in terms of science writing. There's a continuity between science writing and business writing, lots and lots of overlap of trying to communicate what it is that needs to be done, how to do it, and why people should, in fact, invest in you. So they're very, very similar. It's a great book. And the last one is the Tribes book, which is very short, very quirky, but I think a very interesting thing to discuss with your friends. So those are the primary points I wanted to make. I'm very happy to answer any questions or any thoughts you may have. So please raise your hand, and we're happy to start any kind of discussion, any aspect of this that you'd like to pursue. Yes?
You mentioned about writing online. So I'm trying to think of in what ways we can effectively communicate online, like putting something which is visible to the public and not just targeted audiences like in journals now.
There are many websites associated with foundations that have open blogs that you can write. You can also submit opinion pieces, to many websites. Another way to start that is to comment on other people's. Now there's commenting capabilities on other people's papers and that's become very, very sophisticated. The main thing is just to kind of start doing it and find some area that really particularly interests you, that you have a strong feeling about. And there are many, many ways to do that. But I don't know how many blogs there are in your particular area. Probably 20. And all you have to do is go on and search, and you'll find a group of people discussing, something that interests you. LinkedIn, in terms of a more professional, marketing-related site, has I don't know how many thousands of subgroups now, focusing on all kinds of different areas, including many, many areas in biomedical sciences and business-related activities. They have discussions going on between their members all the time. You can post a small position paper in there, and people will comment. There are many, many opportunities. The main thing is simply to find the area out there that in fact interests you, and then pursue it. And you'll have many opportunities to do that. And it's a good way to practice your writing. Any other thoughts, comments, ideas? Yes?
You mentioned writing a 1 to 2 page summary of your brand or what you do. Where do you suggest, how do you suggest getting out there? Where do you suggest putting it?
The ones that I've seen usually are, I mean, for me, it would say Richard C. Maines, because there are about 1,000 Richard Maineses out there, much to my surprise. And a lot of them are in the biomedical area, I've discovered. So you'd write, so basically the domain would be richardcmaines.com. And there are thousands of those out there for academics. If you are in a department or in a research area, they often will have an opportunity to post a bio. You can start with that. If you're in the market for a job, or perhaps something maybe even connected with industry, it's very important. Or going to be doing interviewing. It's a great opportunity to kind of get you out there. It's a way for you to also do something less formal than a resume or a CV. You can write, what it is that interests you, what you'd like to do. Things that you think, I mean, it's an informal way to kind of get you out there visibly. And, I mean, I don't, I don't ever talk to anybody at a meeting that interests me or think about maybe interviewing somebody or looking for a staff person to join Maines Associates without, going online. I mean, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't think of it. And it's a great way to, and the other, I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people over 25 years in Maines Associates. And the simple system I use, which is just a clue, is to put a job ad up, and the only contact with us is to send your CV in and a cover letter telling why you're interested in this job. And 2/3 of the people, I look at the cover letter, that's it, gone. They have no idea why they're interested in this job, or they couldn't, explain it, or they didn't even understand the job. So this is one of the reasons I'm so sensitive to the issue of writing. It's a differentiator, a major differentiator in our world right now, and in the sciences. It's a gigantic one. It's your edge. If you can communicate simply something about what interests you, and what you'd like to do, you've opened a door. Because you've got, all of a sudden you've got somebody, oh, hey, that sounds like somebody I need. So I can't say that too strongly. I've probably said it too many times, but yes, any other comments, questions, thoughts, disagreements? Yes?
I was just wondering how to identify and choose your stakeholders, or they just happen when you go out searching something.
No, I do not think your stakeholders just happen. My view is that, science 25, 30 years ago, there were a lot of sort of built-in formal stakeholders on your education path. That's become, much more dynamic, much more flexible, and it's a much broader group. And I think the key that I would use is when you discover people that you really admire and you really like what they're doing, in some ways it's sort of identifying this tribal leader, somebody out there that seems to be right at the heart of the action that really interests you. That's a potential stakeholder for you. And make sure you contact that person, write that name down, pursue that person, call them up, send them an email. If you're at a conference, go right up and talk to them. So you've got your antenna out there for the hot spots of places that you find interesting. That's your key. That's the community. That's the tribe that you want to be associated with. That's the start of that. By the way, I was going to mention, I brought Maines Associates over the years in trying to learn how to communicate across all these disciplines, has developed some products that we've produced. And I've got some of them that I'll be happy to put out on a displays table and discuss and let you see. One of them is the creation of a one-page experiment abstract. You all know what a standard abstract is like. It's as short as possible and as dense as possible and filled with acronyms. This is a one-page experiment abstract that discusses, basically the hypothesis. Why are you interested in this? How did you do this research? And really, what came out of it in English, so that as many people as possible can understand it. When I started working with NASA in 1979, I went down to the NASA Ames Research Center and managed a contract of scientists and engineers, about 30 people, and we were working with investigators all across the country that were submitting proposals to do space life sciences research. I asked, okay, what do we know? Where's the repository of information that, in fact, is sort of the knowledge base? There was none. NASA funds investigators all across the country. They're responsible for writing up the results. They're responsible for publishing it in journals, and they just disappear. If the experiment doesn't work out, that's it. You don't know it worked out. So one of the first products I did, it took about 7 years to put together, was to collect the entire repository. The area I was working in was in space biology research, and put that together into a book of profiles of experiments and instrumentation and publications and mission profiles. And I have it was all published as a NASA reference publication. I have that. So that was kind of the experiment abstract. Another thing that we helped NASA sort of invent was the mission summary. Missions are done by designers and bioinstrumentation people and hardware developers and flight people and scientists and data people, in this whole raft of people, sometimes maybe 75, 100, 150 people associated with a mission, and a stack of documentation easily as tall as floor to ceiling. And NASA did a very poor job at putting that together, what was learned on a mission that in fact could inform the next mission, like shuttle missions that were done repeatedly. So we developed one of the last, and I have an example of a report that we did on a mission called NeuroLab, which was a neurosciences-focused mission where we went into every one of those arenas, management, science, hardware development, and captured the lessons learned. Put that together into a report. That had never been done in NASA. And so we met with people, got people together, and they talked among each other and were totally shocked at what they learned by talking to each other after a mission. We captured that and put it in. These are some of the kinds of things that we've learned to do simply because we are sort of crossover people between all these groups. So anyway, I'll have those available, and we'll put them outside as soon as we split, and I'd be happy to show them to you and talk about what value they provided. Any other comments or questions? Thoughts?
We do have some refreshments outside, actually, so if we kind of
Should we
take
do
the
that?
conversation
Okay,
outside.
great.
And please let Richard make his way outside. And thank you very much for coming.